Chapter 16. Challenges. In this chapter, we will deal with the common challenges raised against Christian non-resistance and separation. First, let us quickly review the challenges already addressed. Section 16.1. Challenges previously addressed. Considerable time was spent on several important challenges mounted against those who hold to Christian non-resistance. In particular, we examine the challenge posed by merging God's people with the country in which they live, the challenge posed by the Old Testament, and the challenge posed by Christian ethical dualism. Section 16.1.1. Our nation is God's people. 3 chapters were devoted to the challenge posed by the merging of the country in which we live with God's people, the principalities and powers, the scope and purpose of the state, and the nature of the state. From this extended study, it was shown that the state was a rebellious power, even if it has a legitimate God-given function. The state's insistence to be autonomous of all authority to rule as God, and its wisdom based on self-interest and self-preservation causes it to adopt means and seek ends that are opposite to God's. Thus, no state has ever been Christian. Having seen the state's true identity and contrasted it with Jesus' kingdom, we find that we Christians cannot employ the state's means or seek its ends or build its kingdom. We pray that its rulers would act justly and not abuse their office, and we pray for the peace of the nation, but we do not participate in it, employing its means to achieve its ends. Section 16.1.2. The challenge of the Old Testament. The Old Testament, in its entirety, is believed by many to provide an ethical standard that we may still employ. Among other things, those holding this view argue that since God's people killed their enemies and called down imprecations on them, so may we. This claim, however, denies that there is a progressive revelation that is completed in the New Testament, denies that God conceded the practice of things he did not want done because of their inability to obey him, that is, no empowering spirit dwelling in them, and denies the restoration of obedience by the gift of the Spirit. It also denies that the law and prophets are obsolete and passing away. In the chapter examining the Old Testament and its continuity and discontinuity within the New Testament, it was shown that the law and the prophets were preached until John, but now the gospel of the kingdom of God is preached. Thus the law is obsolete and passing away. Those who insist on the use of violence and participation in the state generally agree that much has changed in the new covenant. Temple sacrifices are no more, ceremonial cleansing and dietary laws can be safely ignored, etc. However, despite Jesus' clear command to not resist an evil man and love enemies, they insist that we may still employ violence. This is an arbitrary picking and choosing that plagues us and ought not occur. Insisting that we may still use the Old Testament's ethical standards for fighting evil and dealing with enemies is to live in slavery and bondage to sin and death, for those who live by the law live by the flesh. Why embrace the way of death when Jesus' way is life? Why insist on living by an ethical standard that is obsolete and part of a ministry of condemnation and death? Paul is emphatic, calling the Decalogue itself the ministry of death in letters engraved on stones, that the law was a ministry of condemnation that has no glory compared to the glory of the new covenant. The law and the prophets were not supposed to remain, but pass away. Their purpose was to condemn all before God and thus lead us to faith in Christ. In the fullness of time, Jesus came, and the law was fulfilled. The law had accomplished the purpose for which it was designed and was no longer needed. There is thus a new law, Jesus' law, that governs the behavior of God's people, and non-resistance and love of enemies are central to it. This new law demands more of God's people, for with the gift of the Spirit, they are now careful to obey God's commands. With the gift of the indwelling Spirit of God, there is a completely new sort of human that did not previously exist after the fall, a human that can obey God. Section 16.1.3 The Challenge of Ethical Dualism. An entire chapter was devoted to this evil, troublesome, and pervasive belief that there is one ethical realm for private behavior and another for public or official behavior that allows resistance to evil and that enemies need not be loved. It is not only unwarranted, but support for it cannot be found in the New Testament. It is an idea that is imposed on the biblical text by the Nicaeans and post-Nicaeans in their effort to justify the development of a new theology that would allow Christians to participate in the Christian state Constantine had created. They retained Jesus' law for private affairs, but in public affairs, the violent means of the state were employed. Believing that Christ now reigned through the Emperor Constantine with a rod of iron in a partial but significant eschatological fulfillment, not only over his people, but visibly over the temporal kingdom of Rome, they realized that Christians could now employ violence against their enemies and fully participate in the state. The crucial turning point for these men was their new eschatology that differed greatly from the New Testament and the Ante-Nicaeans. For the Nicene, the final phase of the eschaton had begun since Christ's visible temporal rule had begun, and this rule would continue in perpetuity until Jesus himself came to rule. On the other hand, the Ante-Nicaeans agreed that the eschaton had begun and that Christ had set up his kingdom among those who confessed him as Lord. But the final phase, Jesus' visible reign on earth, was yet to come and would become visible only when Jesus appeared. History had conclusively established that the Nicene and post-Nicene eschatology was wrong. Jesus did not reign through the emperor, and Christendom did not continue. Christendom is on the ash heap of history. However, let us be clear, it was because of this eschatology that they set aside the true Christian faith and caused the fall of Christianity, and married pagan belief and practice with the church. That their eschatology was the reason to permit the Christian use of the sword can be read in their own words, as I have shown in a previous chapter. Augustine was the most explicit, saying, yes, before the eschatological shift, Christians had to live non-resistantly, but after the shift, they could resist the evil man and kill enemies, even heretics. Thus, if Augustine were to be brought back today to see that his eschatology was wrong, even he would have to admit that Christians must live according to Jesus' way as recorded in the Gospels and taught by the apostles. To their credit, in an attempt to mitigate the unbridled use of state violence, some adopted Cicero's just war theory. This, however, proved entirely ineffective, acting more like a salve for sensitive consciences rather than a force to limit violence. The theologians that followed, having seen the failure of the Nicaeans' eschatology, reworked this Constantinianism into new forms that persisted in merging the church and state and continued to hold to the radical separation of public and private ethics. Unfortunately, these ideas, so easily defeated, persist and are present with us today. Section 16.2 Challenges from Scripture. Below are some challenges that have not yet been examined. Section 16.2.1 Jesus in the temple. Cleansing the temple. On 2 occasions, Jesus cleanses the temple, once early in his ministry and once later on near the end. In their pursuit of riches, the Jewish leaders had desecrated the temple, and the Son of God is properly outraged. In John's recording of the event, Jesus makes a whip. In all the accounts, Jesus overturns the money changers' tables and drives out the animals and money changers. From this account, many want to justify Christian violence. Some argue for violence on behalf of religion, protecting its practice, while others argue for violence for any reason. Despite the claim, it is simply impossible to use Jesus' actions to justify Christian violence. First, we have Jesus' clear commands that we must not resist an evil man and love our enemies, blessing them, praying for them, and doing them good. How then do Jesus' actions here limit or undo his clear command? Or how does this action undo the plain teaching of the apostles and the witness of the early church? It cannot. What is clear must interpret what may appear unclear, and it is as clear as the nose on our faces that Jesus commanded non-resistance. Second, even in John's text, where Jesus makes a whip, we are not told if he strikes anyone. The threat posed by a cracking whip is enough to drive out man and beast. It is more likely that Jesus used it in this manner and did not strike any man. Given Jesus' teachings, this is a virtual certainty. Third, we must remember that Jesus is the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, and possesses prerogatives that we do not possess. If Jesus, our Lord and Master, decides it is necessary to cleanse the temple, then he has every right to do so. We, his followers, are bondslaves and obey his commands. Our Master may do things which are forbidden to us. What is God's? In the Synoptic Gospels, we find Jesus challenged with a question. The challenge is occasioned on Jesus' takeover of the temple after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The expectation for many, especially Israel's leaders, is that Jesus is going to precipitate a final showdown and assert his rule. Israel's leaders want nothing of it and want Jesus arrested and put to death. Thus, the reason for the confrontation is not to teach about government and our responsibility to it, but how to get rid of their present Jesus problem. The challenge is cleverly devised. The Jewish leaders asked Jesus if they should pay taxes to Caesar. If Jesus answers no, they can charge him with sedition against Rome and have the Roman authorities arrest him. If he answers yes, they believe that they subvert his messianic claim, for the expectation was that the Messiah was to reestablish the nation and its monarchy and destroy her enemies, which, at that time, was primarily Rome. Having the Messiah accommodate Rome would be inconceivable. Jesus refuses to take the bait and answers the question that should have been asked. What is Caesar's and what is God's? As is often his way, Jesus responds with a question. Bring me a coin. Whose inscription and likeness is on it? Caesar's, they reply. Jesus' response is unexpected. Then render the things that are Caesar's to Caesar, and to God the things that are God's. Jesus' reply was understood by his Jewish adversaries. Man bears the image of God, thus man himself is God's. Only what bore Caesar's image and inscription was Caesar's. All else is God's. Caesar's claim on us is thus severely limited, while God's is unlimited. Caesar may not demand whatever he wants, but God may justly demand anything of us. Unquestioned obedience is reserved only for God, while we only submit to the government when its laws do not conflict with Jesus' law, or submit to its punishment when we must disobey. This interpretation of this confrontation finds considerable support from several writers: Tertullian, Leo Tolstoy, and Jacques Ellul. Tertullian expounds thus: "Therefore, too, the Lord demanded that the money should be shown him, and inquired about the image, whose it was, and, when he had heard it was Caesar's, said, Render to Caesar what are Caesar's, and what are God's to God's. That is, the image of Caesar which is on the coin to Caesar, and the image of God which is on man to God, so as to render to Caesar indeed money, to God yourself. Otherwise, what will be God's if all things are Caesar's?" Tolstoy informs us in this way: "But in reply to the cunning question as to whether the tribute is to be paid to Caesar, he says, Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. That is, give to Caesar what belongs to him, and is made by him, the coin, and to God give what is made by God, and is implanted in you, your soul, your conscience. Give this to no one but God, and so do not do for Caesar what is forbidden by God." And this answer surprises all by its boldness, and at the same time by its unanswerableness. In the footnote to this passage, Tolstoy elaborates: "The striking misinterpretation of the words, 'Give to Caesar what is Caesar's,' as signifying the necessity of obeying Caesar indicates not only the complete misunderstanding of Christ's teaching, but also a complete unwillingness to understand it. In the first place, there is no mention there of obedience. In the second place, if Christ recognized the obligation of paying tribute and also of obedience, he would have said directly, yes, it should be paid. Instead, he says, give to Caesar what is his, that is, the money, and give your life to God. With these latter words, he not only does not encourage any obedience to power, but on the contrary, points out that in everything that belongs to God, it is not right to obey Caesar. Jacques Ellul puts it this way: "But what really belongs to Caesar? The excellent example used by Jesus makes it plain. Whatever bears his mark. Here is the basis and limit of his power. But where is this mark? On coins, on public monuments, and on certain altars. That is all. Render to Caesar. You can pay the tax. Doing so is without importance or significance, for all money belongs to Caesar. And if he wanted, he could simply confiscate it. Paying or not paying taxes is not a basic question. It is not even a true political question. On the other hand, whatever does not bear Caesar's mark does not belong to him. It all belongs to God. This is where the real conscientious objection arises. Caesar has no right whatever to the rest. First, we have life. Caesar has no right of life and death. Caesar has no right to plunge people into war. Caesar has no right to devastate and ruin a country. Caesar's domain is very limited. We may oppose most of his pretensions in the name of God. Some, like Martin Luther, use this passage to teach that the state may demand anything of us. But the passage's context, that is, its occasion and the underlying Jewish theme that man is created in the image of God and is thus God's, prevent such a use. The context and the content do not allow this passage to bear the weight Luther and others place on it. This is especially true when the rest of the Scriptures are consulted. In particular, Romans 12, 9 through 21, Romans 13, 1 through 14, Matthew 5, 38 to 48, Luke 6, 27 to 49, 1 Peter 2, 18 to 25, and similar passages. Section 16.2.2 Encounters with Soldiers. Those wishing to support the Christian use of violence make an appeal to 3 encounters with soldiers that appear in the New Testament. John the Baptist and the soldiers. The first account involves John the Baptist. John's ministry of baptism and repentance was the main event in Israel immediately before Jesus came on the scene. Faithful Jews were coming to him in large numbers for baptism and advice. In his encounter with the soldiers asked John what they should do. He tells them, "Do not take money from anyone by force or accuse anyone falsely, and be content with your wages." Those wishing to support the Christian use of violence argue that because John does not demand that they cease soldiering, it is thus right and proper to be a soldier. There are several problems with this argument. First, John's commands are made under the Old Covenant. Jesus says that the law and the prophets were until John, but now that he is here, the gospel of the kingdom of God is preached. We have dealt at length with the status of the law, that it is obsolete, and a new law of love governs God's people. Soldiering was permissible under the law of Moses, but not under Jesus' law of love. Second, it is nearly inconceivable that the soldiers were Roman. Roman soldiers were not in the habit of getting advice from Jewish prophets. Thus, it is highly probable that they were Jewish soldiers employed by the chief priests or Herod. Hence, the account cannot be used to argue that Jews or Christians were in the Roman army at this time. The passage is silent on this. Jesus and Peter with centurions. Before we examine the next 2 encounters, we must review a bit of basic logic, specifically the informally fallacious argument from silence, or the appeal to ignorance. In an argument appealing to ignorance, a lack of knowledge is used to prove some point. In other words, a lack of evidence proves the claim. Peter Kreeft provides an excellent explanation of why this is fallacious. When a speaker or writer is silent about X, we cannot conclude that he does not believe in X, or that there is no X. The fallacy called the argument from silence does just that. For example, notice that the author never refers to her husband, and there is no evidence whatever of any reference to her husband in any documents of her time or later, by her friends or by her enemies. Therefore, she must have been unmarried. Those making this sort of argument are literally proving nothing. Silence cannot establish the truth value of a claim. Silence is not evidence. In fact, if silence were evidence, then anything could be proven, in which case nothing could be proven. However, on the matter of non-resistance, we have a great deal of positive evidence supporting the assertion that a Christian must be non-resistant. It is this sort of invalid argument, an argument from silence, that is frequently employed in Jesus and Peter's encounter with the centurion to support the claim that a Christian can be a soldier. In each case, it is argued that because neither Jesus nor Peter addresses non-resistance, given that these men are soldiers, it must be fine for a follower of Christ to be a soldier and employ violence. The absence of an injunction against the use of violence is proof that an injunction is neither necessary nor appropriate. It is an appeal to silence, and hence ignorance, and proves nothing. Our lack of knowledge in each instance is severe, however. First, we do not know if the conversation continued, and what further information was communicated. Second, we do not know the knowledge the centurions possessed prior to the encounter, nor of the decisions they had made beforehand regarding their involvement in violent activity. Having only the information recorded in the accounts, can we say that a conversation regarding non-resistance took place, or that they had previously decided to leave the military? Of course not. For ignorance, silence proves nothing. At this point, we are unable to make any claims arguing for a prior commitment to non-resistance or a conversation that took place later, for for the same reason that one cannot use silence to claim that because there is no injunction against violence, the use of violence by a Christian soldier is permitted. Those making an appeal to ignorance to prove that soldiering and thus violence is permissible have a further problem. It is well known that at the time, common soldiers and their officers were involved in pagan practices, but neither Jesus nor Peter tell these men that they should no longer be involved in these practices. Should we then assume that since there is no mention of a command against participation in pagan practices, that such activity is allowed? Of course not. Why would we so conclude? We would not make such a conclusion because there are clear teachings in the Scriptures that Christians cannot participate in pagan religions. Why do we understand this and fail to understand that God's people must not use violence when we have Jesus' life, teachings, the life and writings of the apostles, and the witness of the early church that all affirm Christian non-resistance and love of enemies? Some will continue to insist that Christians may employ violence by appealing to the Old Testament, but we have already seen that God's revelation to Paul in many scriptures has cut off such an appeal, for the law and the prophets, having been fulfilled, are now inoperative, and a new way of life is normative. To ignore the clear example of Jesus' life, his teachings, the apostles, and the early church's witness is unconscionable and inexcusable. This willful and selective refusal to accept a clear teaching of Christ's is persistently done with non-resistance, while most of his other teachings are taken at face value. It is an extraordinary and evil state of affairs. It seems we turn off our theological, exegetical, and logical minds when we come to Christ's teachings on love of enemies and non-resistance. Returning to the texts, we find that there are not only logical problems with the pro-soldiering reading, but there are other contextual problems. In Jesus' encounter, there is no evidence that the centurion intends to follow Christ, only that he desires healing for his servant. He may have decided to follow Christ, but the passage is silent on this. It is also clear that neither Jesus nor the centurion met, for the centurion sent messengers to Jesus. Thus, Jesus was not teaching the centurion how he was to live, but fulfilling his request to heal his servant. Furthermore, the passage's purpose is to show Israel's faithlessness in comparison to a Roman's exceptional faith in God, and also a prefiguring of the future inclusion of Gentiles into the family of God. The context contains a non-Jew who has more faith than any Jew Jesus had found in Israel. The focus is on Jesus' ability to heal and the centurion's faith. Nothing is said about what is required to become one of God's people or how God's people must live. It is completely silent on these issues, just as it is on participation in pagan practices within the Roman army. Peter's encounter is included to show that entrance into God's family was by faith, not by the law, and that the Gentile was admitted by faith just like the Jew. It was not a lesson on Christian non-resistance. However, given Jesus' life, teachings, and the writings of the apostles, it is far more likely to assume that, if necessary, Peter would have informed the centurion on non-resistance as well as pagan practices within the Roman army. The conclusion above that Peter would have addressed, if necessary, non-resistance and pagan practices is not based on ignorance, but on the consistent teachings found within the Scriptures and the life of the early church. There are good reasons to believe it. Given the same witness, there are no good reasons to assume that soldiering and the use of violence is approved. Jesus and Peter's encounters with their centurions provide no support for either the approval of violence nor its disapproval. To adjudicate the matter, we must make an appeal to clear scriptural teachings. On this topic, the Scriptures could not be clearer. Section 16.2.3. Paul's appeal to Roman law. In the book of Acts, Paul makes several appeals to Roman law. In the first instance, some Jews from Asia seek Paul in the temple and incite a riot. Seeing that Paul is the center of the commotion, the Romans assume that he is the cause and place him under arrest. He is taken to the barracks where the Romans prepare to flog him. Paul, a Roman citizen, knows that it is unlawful to flog a Roman without a hearing, and thus makes his citizenship known to the Roman officials, avoiding the flogging. In the second instance, we find Paul still in Roman custody for the disturbance in the temple. The current Roman governor has offered to take Paul to Jerusalem to face his Jewish accusers. Paul knows, however, that there will likely be an attempt on his life during the journey to Jerusalem. Instead of taking the governor's offer, Paul makes an appeal to Caesar, since a Roman citizen had the right to have Caesar rule on his case. Thus Paul escapes the clutches of his would-be Jewish assassins. Some take this passage to mean that it is right and proper for a Christian to participate in government. But can this claim be sustained? Consider for a moment what Paul is doing. The Roman government had enacted laws that governed its treatment of Roman citizens in order to protect them from abuse by the government. It also provided access to the emperor in legal matters, again to ensure that justice would be done. Obviously, Paul was simply making an appeal for Roman officials to obey the laws they had placed upon themselves to protect the innocent and ensure justice, the very task God has given to the state. To ask the state to obey its own laws is not participation in it. Paul was in no way coercing, using personal power, or employing violence, nor was he participating in government. Thus, in no way can Paul's appeal to Roman law be understood to be participation in government. To such a claim, the passage is no help. Section 16.2.4. David's imprecations. The imprecations in the Old Testament are frequently employed to support the use of violence. The attempt utterly fails if we understand the relationship between the Old and New Testaments. An imprecation is a prayer for evil, a curse if you will, to come on one's own enemies or on the enemies of another. In the Old Testament we find both of these types, and in Psalms we find them in abundance. A particularly good example of calling down evil upon one's own enemies is found in Psalm 109. The first part of the psalm, verses 1 through 5, is a chronicle of the evil done to David by his enemies. Verses 6 through 20 is the imprecation and is given below. Appoint a wicked man over him, and let an accuser stand at his right hand. When he is judged, let him come forth guilty, and let his prayer become sin. Let his days be few, let another take his office. Let his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. Let his children wander about and beg, and let them seek sustenance far from their ruined homes. Let the creditor seize all that he has, and let strangers plunder the product of his labor. Let there be none to extend loving kindness to him, nor any to be gracious to his fatherless children. Let his posterity be cut off in a following generation. Let their name be blotted out. Let the iniquity of his fathers be remembered before the Lord, and do not let the sin of his mother be blotted out. Let them be before the Lord continually, that he may cut off their memory from the earth, because he did not remember to show loving kindness, but persecuted the afflicted and the needy man, and the despondent in heart, to put them to death. He also loved cursing, so it came to him, and he did not delight in blessing, so it was far from him. But he clothed himself with cursing as with his garment, and it entered into his body like water, and like oil into his bones. Let it be to him as a garment with which he covers himself, and for a belt with which he constantly girds himself. Let this be the reward of my accusers from the Lord, and of those who speak evil against my soul. This is perhaps the most lengthy example, but it is no means isolated. If David and the other prophets who prayed imprecations were examples to follow, and they were, then it would not be saying too much that the law and the prophets taught hatred of enemies. Given the frequency at which these imprecations occur, and the men who made them, we cannot fail to conclude that the Old Testament, by the example of the prophets, taught hatred of enemies, despite what we find in Proverbs 25, verses 21 and 22, and other examples of mercy done to enemies. These acts of mercy in no way undo the teaching that enemies are to be hated and evil called down on them. It is for this teaching that Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.'" Jesus was accurately stating the teaching in the Old Testament. Jesus was not correcting a false teaching, but establishing the law of the New Covenant, a law very different from the law of the Old Covenant embodied in the law of Moses, that was even then obsolete and passing away. It is significant that Jesus gives no special cases in which we may set aside his commands for non-resistance and love of enemies. There really are no exceptions, and we must not resist the evil man, and we really must love our enemies, blessing them, praying for them, and doing them good. Does this in any way resemble what we find in David's words in Psalm 109? No. We find the very opposite of what Jesus commands. Furthermore, David's words are the opposite of what we find throughout the entire New Testament and in the life of the early church and the faithful that followed. In the Gospels, we find Jesus commands an example. What Jesus does for us, his enemies, is exactly what he commands of those who follow him. He loves his enemies, blesses those who curse him, prays for them, asking God to forgive them, lets them take his garments, and does not resist the evil man, who not only beats him, but takes his life. And dying as our sacrifice, he does for mankind, God's enemies, the greatest good of all. In Acts, we find Christians driven from their homes and martyred, and neither resistance nor violence is returned. We find in Hebrews 10 that Christians accepted joyfully the seizure of their property. In the epistles, we find more commands to live peaceably, love our enemies, and live just as Jesus lived, even as he went to the cross. Thus, what are we to do? How can we reconcile the law and the prophets with Jesus? Is there a different God in the Old Testament? Did God give up on the law and try something else with Jesus? The answer is that there is only one triune God in both the New and Old Testaments, and that it was his plan all along that the law and the prophets would end after they had accomplished the purpose set for them, that is, to be a tutor and a guardian during mankind's childhood, to make sin exceedingly sinful, and place all under the judgment of God until the fullness of the times when the Son of God would come to set to rights what had been undone by the fall, that is, reconcile man to God and restore obedience by the gift of the Spirit, enabling our ability to follow a more perfect law, the law of Christ. But under the guardian, the law and the prophets, man was in bondage, Israel was in bondage, even as it lived in the land of promise, for they were slaves to sin and death, and they would not and could not faithfully obey God's commands. Thus they were sent away into exile, and the kingdom taken from them. Men and women before the new covenant and the gift of the Spirit did not live well. That they could not obey God apart from his redemptive work was the point of the law and the prophets. God's people were a complete failure, not because God failed, but because they were bound to, given the spiritual limitations, that is, they did not have the Spirit. Because of this, God conceded to them a lesser moral life. Those now empowered by the Spirit and freed from the power of sin and the principalities and powers are commanded to live according to a law that demands a higher ethical standard. Thus, David's imprecations no longer serve as an example to God's people. They did at one time, but that way is obsolete, and a new law governs God's people. To use the witness of the Old Testament as an example of how to treat enemies, we would have to renounce Christ. Section 16.3. Christians must take charge. If Christians don't take up power and rule, then evil will prevail, is a common refrain. It sounds good, but is it true? What does history tell us? Christendom was a 1400-year experiment with Christian rule, and its greatest accomplishment was to give cause for the pagan to blaspheme the name of God. Immediately after taking power, the heretic was tortured and killed, and the empire wrapped its rapacious territorial expansion in Christianity. Then followed the Holy Crusades, where Christendom's enemies were mercilessly slaughtered. Later, the Christian nations in Europe fought religious wars. It is true that these wars were also the consequence of secular interests as the nation-state developed, but the religious dimension cannot be explained away. In England, we had the Protestant King Charles and Puritan Oliver Cromwell's revolution that ripped England apart and killed thousands. And who could not love to live in Calvin's Geneva or in Catholic Spain during the Counter-Reformation? We also have the excellent Christian behavior of England that started and developed the African slave trade and raped India for 200 years. And what of the great Christian nation, the United States of America, that enslaved the black man, conducted a 300-year war against the American Indian, fought a civil war that killed 650,000, and killed several million in the Just War, World War II. We could cite many more examples. Many more wonderful examples of blessed Christian rule could be cited, but these are sufficient to make the point. History confirms that Christians at the helm of the state have behaved horribly. For this, there are neither effective excuses nor mitigating factors. It is true that Christendom had its virtues and took Western civilization to its greatest heights, and Christians may not have behaved as poorly as pagans, and certainly not as bad as atheist communists. But Jesus commands that those who bear his name resist not the evil man. Never coerce or employ violence, but rather love all, even their enemies. Refusing to obey Jesus, all we so-called Christians have done is give cause for the pagan to blaspheme God's name. How much better off would the world be if these Christians, so eager to set things right by power and violence, had given themselves wholly over to walking in obedience to Jesus' law and building his kingdom? The world will never know. Finally, listen to what Leo Tolstoy has to say on the matter of Christians taking up power and employing violence to preserve order. You often say that you serve in the military because if you did not, the existing order would be destroyed, and disturbances and every kind of calamities would occur. But firstly, it is not true that you are concerned with the maintenance of the existing order. You are concerned only with your own advantages. Secondly, even if your abstinence from military service did not destroy the existing order, this would in no way prove that you should continue to do what is wrong, but only that the order which is being destroyed by your abstinence should be destroyed. Section 16.4. It won't work. It's impractical. Yes, it is true that it is impractical to run a state according to Jesus' ethical imperatives. But this should not come as a surprise. For those outside Christ who are citizens of the earthly kingdoms do not subject themselves to Jesus' law and refuse God's redemptive grace. Thus, God has conceded the use of violence to those not of the kingdom of God to control those among them who refuse to live peaceably and, thereby, mark out a space of relative stability for human society. That Jesus' way does not work for those still in rebellion should not come as a surprise, for Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 2, But a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them, because they are spiritually appraised. If this passage isn't enough to convince us of the impossibility of making the state Christian, consider this from Romans chapter 3. There is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Given that this characterizes those outside Christ, it is impractical to think that we can make the state Christian, or even make it behave in a true Christian manner. The Christian's task is quite different, as we have seen, for ours is the ministry of reconciliation, and we have another king, another kingdom, and a new way of life. Jesus' way of life does not work for those who deny his lordship, but it works just fine and is perfectly practical for those who live under Jesus' rule. History proves it to be so. Section 16.5. Christians cannot live that way. Some charge that Jesus' way is only an ideal, and we cannot actually live that way, and to insist that we try is unhelpful. To this challenge, we have a great many scriptures that say just the opposite. For the expectation of the Old Testament and the command of the New Testament is that the people of God, once the Spirit is given, will live lives characterized by faithful obedience. Does not Ezekiel say that God will give his Spirit and his people will be careful to obey his statutes? Does not Jesus insist on obedience, saying that only those that keep his word will enter the kingdom? Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Does not Jesus say that if you love me, you will obey me? If you do not obey me, you do not love me? And does not Jesus say that we are to love our enemies and thus be perfect as our Father is perfect? And what of the apostles? Does not Paul say that it is an impossibility that disobedience would persistently characterize a Christian's life? Does not James say that faith without works is dead? Does not John say that he who says that he has come to know him but does not keep his commandments is a liar and the truth is not in him? And does he not also say that we must walk as Jesus walked? And do we not have the witness of Stephen, the early church, and the faithful church down through the ages? The answer to all of the above is yes. God, by the gift of the Spirit of God, has enabled his people to walk in obedience, living in moral purity, mutually submitted to one another, forgiving all, loving all, even enemies. Those who insist that Jesus' way cannot actually be lived deny Jesus' life and words and the power of the Spirit. Section 16.6. The failure of just war theory. The just war tradition is claimed to be not only a suitable criterion for the determination of a justifiable war and its ethical prosecution, but also justification for Christian participation in war. In fact, many Christian theologians make an appeal to just war theory to justify Christian involvement in war. Given its importance, we must carefully examine its claims. At this point, we must make a clear distinction between several of the underlying assumptions of the Christian use of the just war tradition and the view of Christian non-resistance and separation affirmed in this book. The just war theologian generally assumes at the outset that there is a dual ethical system, one governing the Christian's private life and another his public life. On the other hand, biblical non-resistance and love of enemies assumes one Christian ethic. By application, the just war theologian assumes that a Christian can participate in the state and employ its violent means to achieve certain desirable ends, in particular peace. Biblical non-resistance denies both. The just war theologian believes that there is a redemptive capacity to violence, that absolute, not only relative goods can be achieved. Biblical non-resistance denies this activity to Christians while granting that God may use nations to judge other nations. This activity is understood as God using evil men to punish other evil men, and remains an exclusively divine prerogative in which God's people do not participate, for reasons already discussed. The just war theologian further assumes that it is a worthwhile and necessary activity for Christians to inform the state on ethical matters. The view here is different in several respects. It is agreed that Christians have a responsibility to witness to the state, reminding it of its legitimate mandate and condemning it when it exceeds it. However, making the state Christian, even in a limited way, is not a worthwhile project, for the state is chief among the principalities and powers, and from the description in Romans 3, they are, for all intents and purposes, incorrigible. Furthermore, we are told that those who do not have the Spirit are not only unable to understand God, but they are incapable of obeying Him. Given these facts, along with the reality of Jesus' kingdom and the command to build Jesus' kingdom, and the ministry of reconciliation given to the church, the Christian pours his effort into building God's kingdom, knowing that attempts to make the state Christian are doomed to failure. However, the Christian still witnesses to the state, both in word and, most importantly, in deed, that is, living faithfully under Jesus' lordship. His witness is primarily a consequence of his life. Thus, at the outset, the just war theologian begins with different assumptions from those found in the biblical record and affirmed by the early church. It is also important to realize that the just war theologian does not find support for his theology in the New Testament. Instead, he imposes his theology on the biblical text and begins, just like the Nicaeans, with the affirmation that things are different now that Christ rules through the emperor, that is, the state, and we may safely set aside Jesus' example, teachings, the apostolic writings, and the 3-century witness of the early church, and employ violence in the name of the state. Some, however, don't even presume that non-resistance was ever normative. But we have seen that the Nicene eschatology, by which so many changes were justified, was proven false, and the primitive witness of the church remains undefeated. With these thoughts in mind, let us briefly examine the just war tradition. The just war tradition rose out of the new theological demands placed on Christianity by the merging of church and state by the Roman Emperor Constantine. If Christians are now permitted to employ violence in the name of the state, it is necessary to devise a system of restraints or limits to this violence, given the undeniable pressure against violence in the New Testament. Of course, Jesus' explicit commands to non-resistance and love of enemies were subverted by their eschatological conclusions, as we noted above, and they remain subverted still by most bearing the name Christian, despite the fact that the original reasons for their abandonment have been proven false. Nevertheless, there is a genuine desire by many who hold to this tradition to make those who employ war to adhere to limits. The goal is a good one, but we must ask if just war is a credible theory. Does it actually work? Has it been successfully applied? Just war and its effort to justify Christian involvement in war cannot be supported by the Scriptures or the witness of the early church. Since it does not represent the position commanded by Jesus, and because it remains a complete failure, we must challenge it by a realistic evaluation of its assertions and performance in light of the very requirements of the tradition itself. Specifically, are the requirements consistent and clear, and can they be followed by those who want to live by them? The first systematic development of just war is found in the works of the pagan Roman Cicero, 43 BC. The Nicene theologian Ambrose of Milan, 397 AD, gave a limited presentation, while Augustine, 430 AD, and then Thomas Aquinas, 1247 AD, developed it further. Subsequent eras brought further developments and modifications. Thus, we do not have a single universally agreed upon systematic statement of just war theology, but rather a just war tradition that deals with two dimensions. The first is the determination of a justifiable war, jus ad bellum, and the second, the ethical prosecution of war, jus in bello. In the main, we have the following criteria. The determination of a justifiable war relies on the application of the following criteria. Just cause. The cause for war must be just. The war cannot be conducted for selfish or merely relative goods. Comparative justice. One of the belligerents must be more just in its pursuit of war than the other party, even if both parties have caused suffering and injustice. Competent authority. Only authorized government authorities may conduct war. Right intention. The intention to conduct war must be driven by a desire to protect or right an injustice, and not for personal or national gain or vendetta. Probability of success. There must be a reasonable probability of success. If there is no possibility of victory, you must not fight. Last resort. All peaceful means to resolve the conflict must be explored and employed. Only then may war proceed. Proportionality. The benefits of fighting the war must outweigh the cost of the war. The ethical prosecution of a war is determined by the application of the following criteria. The means must be indispensable. The means employed in the war must be necessary, not gratuitous. Weapons and tactics not needed to secure victory must not be used. The means must be discriminating. The means must at least discriminate between combatant and civilian and between the warring countries and neutral countries. The means must be proportional. The means must be proportional to the enemy's means. For example, a small incursion against a minor military target does not result in the bombing of a large civilian population that kills thousands. Finally, the means must conform to international law. These requirements are all well and good, but consider what must be known to successfully apply the criteria for the determination of a justifiable war. What must be the extent of our knowledge to establish the probability of success, or that war is the last resort? These are questions that do not admit to deterministic scientific numerical analysis. Is it not always the case, and does not history affirm that our knowledge is horribly limited in such matters? How does one determine an enemy's true intentions when in the heat of conflict we find it difficult to understand our own? How does one determine if all the alternatives have been employed and exhausted when the use of violence is so easy and we have made no preparations for seeking and employing nonviolent alternatives, but have made every preparation for war? And how do we compute the probability of success? History shows that this is always problematic, but there is a further difficulty. What is the proper definition of success? What does victory look like? Does a relative peace immediately after the war justify our actions, or is a deeper and longer-term peace needed? May not the war that brings a temporary peace precipitate a greater war and greater evil as World War I caused World War II? What means are there at our disposal to answer these questions? How does one kill an enemy with the right intention, that is, in love? Are our minds so corrupted that we believe that we can kill in love? And are we so naive as to believe that war does not breed hatred and bloodlust? How do we ensure that the benefits of fighting the war outweigh the expected evils that come from the war? How do we establish that our cause is just? This is a greater problem than many are willing to admit. Certainly, if we are attacked and forced into a defensive war, it may be just, as just is defined in the just war context. But how do we establish that we bear no culpability for the attack? History is replete with examples where the state has hidden its covert violence and covert diplomacy that provokes an attack. How can the state be trusted to release the truth to enable an informed evaluation to establish the justice of its cause? History conclusively shows that we cannot trust the United States of America or any other nation. The matter is further complicated when nations are informed by different religions or even atheism. What we or our any believe to be legitimate behavior may be seen as an outright act of war. With respect to the ethical prosecution of war, how are we to establish that an action is necessary? Can we look into the future and know this? Can we even know all that needs to be known at the time the decision must be made? Can we choose to let our soldiers die and not employ the weapon or tactic, since it is not necessary to win the war? Are we even likely to do so, even knowing that? It has been established by historians and was affirmed by the American generals that there was no need to drop the atomic weapons on Japan to end World War II. America's leaders did it because they could, and because they wanted to demonstrate the extent of their military power to the Soviets, who had become a threat. Piled on top of all these problems is another problem, implied in almost everything we have discussed, specifically the necessity to know and understand human moral causality. By this I mean we must understand and be able to accurately predict how another human being will respond to our actions, and, on the other hand, how we will respond to the actions of another. Certainly, our own experience reveals the impossibility of this task. Thus, what we think is an action that will end the war may cause our enemy to harden his resolve and fight the war with greater violence and resolve. How do we know that the subsequent string of events that may follow will not lead to a spiral of violent action, where each step is believed necessary but ends in millions of dead, achieving only a brief relative peace, or no real peace at all? It can be successfully argued that World War I brought us Soviet Russia, and World War II brought us the massive expansion of Soviet Russia and the Communist Chinese. Is the 170 million killed by these states worth the two wars? It is quite likely that these abominations would not have existed without them. But what of the other criteria that are more easily established, such as proportionality of means and the discrimination between combatants and non-combatants? In each case, America has ignored them. In most of America's wars, little to no distinction has been made between combatant and non-combatant. Generally, America has waged total war against its enemies. Today, Americans are less inclined to target civilians because our weapons are more accurate. But if civilians are co-located with a high-value target, America's leaders have no qualms about killing them as well. Nor do they have a problem destroying necessary infrastructure, which indirectly causes the death of many more civilians. The decision to go to war is already a decision to kill the innocent. America euphemistically calls them collateral damage. As to proportionality, America completely fails. America insists that its enemies lie before its feet in unconditional surrender or be killed even in retreat, as in the first Gulf War on the highway out of Kuwait City. America knows little to nothing of mercy and proportionality in war. History and basic epistemology show that just war theory is unable to deliver on its claims. Historically, it has been ignored. Epistemologically, the knowledge required to apply it is unavailable. With regard to human nature, that is, the men described in Romans 3 who do not know the way of peace and are quick to shed blood, the very men who wage war, it is impossible for them to remove the influence of self-interest from their deliberations and come to unbiased conclusions. The tradition is also unable to speak univocally in defining its criteria or in the selection of the criteria, and it provides no prescription to ensure that the application of the criteria is done with unbiased, dispassionate analysis rather than self-interest. Our capacity for self-deception is tremendous and can magically turn self-interest into selfless altruism. The likelihood for such self-deception is even greater when life and death are at stake. But no provision is made within the tradition to seriously deal with this factor. Nor does it take seriously that rulers down through the ages have essentially ignored the just war tradition and acted in self-interest. The just war tradition, although held by sincere men desiring to limit the evil of war, is not credible. To say that its criteria and their application are only problematic is to be generous beyond what it deserves. History shows that it has never been seriously applied. What war or action within a great war was stopped because of its application? The few examples one may find will only serve to prove the point. Despite these weaknesses, theologians and denominational spokesmen affirm that just war theory remains the official position of the Church. This, however, claims too much. For while the rank and file who every week shuffle in and out of America's churches may be able to say the words just war, they neither understand its foundations nor do they live by it. For all but a few Christians outside the peace churches, the more common views are realism, crusading, self-interest, and macho, that is, Rambo-based war theologies, if I may be permitted to abuse the word thus. The realist holds that it is impossible to think morally about war. The crusader believes that his war is divinely approved. Others affirm that it is right and proper that the nation make judgments based on self-interest, however its interests might be defined or established. The Rambo affirms that his enemy's humanity is irrelevant, and that his prowess in war is validation enough for his actions. The four views just mentioned, not just war and certainly not love of enemies, inform our Christian masses, and they give opportunity to blaspheme God to those who refuse to confess Jesus as Lord. The just war tradition has completely failed to prevent war, but has had some impact on the way war is prosecuted. Much international law is informed by this tradition and has had some positive impact. I am grateful for any mitigation of man's violent tendencies, and I am thankful that there are some that take this mission seriously. But the underlying assumptions that provide the foundation upon which this tradition stands are nothing more than sand, and the house has not been able to stand. The Christian just war tradition has had 1,700 years to prove itself, and yet it has never worked effectively. It insists that Christians must be involved in government and use its means in limited ways, but the ethical demands Jesus places on his people shut off this way to them. Jesus disarmed all Christians when he told Peter to put away the sword. Let us Christians who affirm Jesus as Lord speak to the nations and encourage them to be more just and less violent. But let us lay aside man's violent ways, leave his kingdom and build Jesus' kingdom, and show the world whose kingdom they must enter and how they are to live within it. Section 16.7. Conclusion. The challenges raised against Christian non-resistance and separation are less than weak and without effect. They are easily defeated by history, the Scriptures, the witness of the early church, and those Christians who have remained faithful down through the ages. Jesus was and remains the King. he claimed to be and sits on his throne at the right hand of the Father, who is blessed forever and ever. And he has established his rule over his people, and thus established his kingdom by the power of the cross, that is, his death at the hands of his enemies, leaving us an example to follow. Jesus has commanded and enabled his people to live new lives by the power of the Spirit of God, to the glory of the Father. Never before has the world seen such humans who are careful to obey God's commands, humans who really live, who revel in the blessing and freedom of obedience to God's commands. Never has man been so free, no longer enslaved to the law of sin and death, or oppressed by the principalities and powers. Never has man lived in community with fellow servants, mutually submitted to one another, sacrificially caring for one another, refusing to coerce or employ violence, forgiving all, loving all, even enemies. Never has man truly been given such a glorious task as the ministry of reconciliation. Truly, those in Christ live in a world created anew.